This is Smarter Cars, a podcast about autonomous vehicles.
This is the finish line. The Stanford racing team has made its way into the history books.
But the most important thing for me is, it doesn't matter who comes first. It matters that we as a community achieve it.
Early in a technology, 1,000 flowers should bloom.
Welcome to Smarter Cars. This is your host, Michelle Kairouz. Today's episode is with Lucy Yu, Head of Innovation and New Mobility Services at the UK government's Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. Lucy has a Master of Science in Chemistry from Imperial College London and has worked for numerous technology startups as well. Lucy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Oh. So you are the Head of Innovation and New Mobility Services at the UK's Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. Can you tell us a little bit about the centre, when it was formed, and what your purpose and mission is?
So CCAV was formed in 2015. So in fact, we just had our second birthday just last week. Mm-hmm. We are a joint policy unit of two ministries of state in the UK government. So one of those is the Department for Transport, and the other one is is called BEIS, our Department for Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy. So we're one team. We're formed of staff from both of those ministries, and that's really handy because it gives us just a little bit more clout in what we do. It gives us access to two sets of ministers with slightly different portfolios. So we have a very broad remit in a way that not many parts of government are able to achieve. And we were put together really with a number of different objectives. I guess our kind of first strategic objective is really to ensure that the UK has got a very vibrant and really world-leading connected and autonomous vehicle industry. So that's very much about attracting investment and building UK capability. We think we have a world-class kind of automotive industry in the UK and lots of kind of strength in academia, but there's also a lot of competition in the sector from places like the US and Germany and Japan and China. So one of the key goals here is to secure investment and to figure out areas where we can have some early successes and capture some kind of UK industrial advantage there. Right. We have a second strategic objective, which is really around ensuring that the UK remains one of the best places in the world to develop and use connected and autonomous vehicles. And really that's about safely kind of clearing away any of the barriers that might exist in our regulatory framework, encouraging our transport operators to innovate and also bringing the public with us. So we have some key goals there around things like engaging the public, figuring out the most effective regulatory reform strategy, trying to drive progress on relevant international regulations, and unlocking potential around things like vehicle connectivity, encouraging infrastructure operators to engage early, and looking at things like new business models such as mobility as a service. So that's really quite a broad objective.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then a couple more things. So one of those is around ensuring connected and autonomous vehicles in the UK are what we refer to as secure by design, and they handle data appropriately. So obviously, as vehicles are becoming more connected and the level of automation increases, cyber threats increase, and it's really important that consumers can trust that the CCAV ecosystem is resilient to cyber attacks and also protects personal data. So we're working a lot with the industry in that area as well to make sure that we take the appropriate steps to design cybersecurity into these vehicles and to have a framework for the handling of data. So we have quite a broad remit across a range of areas, but that's the kind of the basic outline.
Great. And so starting, I guess, with the formation of the center, can you give us sort of a little timeline of what policies the UK has put in place that govern autonomous vehicles?
So broadly speaking, at our inception or around the point we were formed, we conducted a review of a detailed review of all of the regulatory framework in the UK to understand whether there were any barriers to testing automated vehicle technology in the UK. And that's available online. So anyone can download that document. It's quite a long document, but essentially that confirmed that anybody could conduct tests in the UK. Now they have to follow UK road traffic law. They have to have a roadworthy vehicle and a couple of other factors as well. But we have a very open regulatory framework. So, for instance, we don't require people to obtain a permit before they can conduct activities. They're not limited to specific regions or areas, so they can operate on any public roads. We don't require them to put down a surety bond, for instance, so there's not a potential financial barrier to entry for smaller businesses. So we have a very open climate. We, at the same time, after conducting that review, we published our Code of Practice for Testing. So we published that first version in July 2015, and I can talk a little bit later about some of the updates we're currently making to that. And that was intended really to kickstart some testing and some early trialling in the UK in this area. It's advisory only, so it's not a kind of statutory document, but in practice, a lot of organisations have found it really useful in setting up some of the very early trials that we have in the UK.
So yeah. Are the provisions, when you say it's not statutory, would you say that compliance with the code is all of it voluntary, or are there certain provisions which are mandatory, or are those just reiterating existing statutory law?
It's a reiteration of existing statutory law. Now, we have found actually that organisations who are conducting trialling and piloting in the UK, they generally do follow the code, and it tends to be something that their insurers are very keen to see, that they're compliant with the code and they've read the code and they're observing some of the points that are in the code. But the other thing I didn't say about it is we always intended, even from the date of publication, that it wouldn't be a static document, that we would take feedback as we learnt and as organisations learnt from the trials and the pilots that they were conducting, and that we would revise and update and amend the code based on that feedback.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us, broadly speaking, do you require a human to be in the car while there's testing, or is there a provision for testing a car with no one in it?
So at the moment, so the current code does refer to safety drivers and test drivers, and there is a requirement for somebody to be effectively to be monitoring the road and able to, ready, willing and able to take back control if needed. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be a human in the vehicle. If a testing organisation is able to present a good safety case, if you like, that could be a person outside the vehicle who's ready, willing and able to take control. So at the moment, there is a requirement for a human driver, be they inside the vehicle or outside the vehicle. Now we are looking at, I mentioned we're looking at updates to the code. That is an area we are focused on at the moment. There may be some exemptions in the law that we can signpost that would enable organisations who feel that are in a position to potentially do some slightly more ambitious, complex testing to be able to proceed in the next couple of years.
There's been a lot of discussion here about the question of using a remote operator, and perhaps even having that be a key component of helping the car when it gets stuck in certain situations, having that remote operation. So it's an interesting area. I'm not sure from the technology perspective how exactly it works, but it is interesting you guys are thinking as well about how to facilitate that. What about the traditional design of the car? Are you requiring today that the car have a steering wheel or manual controls?
Well, so there are most of the cars we're seeing still have what we would describe as, I suppose, conventional controls. So things like a steering wheel. Now we have a set of what are called construction and use regulations. There are actually means for developers to use vehicles that don't meet those construction and use regulations. There is a process set out by which they can apply for an exemption from specific construction and use regulations. So that could include, for instance, vehicles that don't have a steering wheel, for example. So we have seen applications for exemptions in other areas outside of the AV space, so they've just been slightly unusual vehicle designs. So in many respects, that sort of thing may just be almost like an incremental progression of some of the stuff that the Department for Transport has previously handled.
It sounds a little bit similar to the federal motor vehicle safety standards here in the U.S., where you sort of need an exemption in order to not have the steering wheel. Yeah. And the scope of the code of practice for testing is what we would think of as levels 3 through 5 vehicles. Is that fair?
Yeah, so that is fair. I guess our sort of our definition of an automated vehicle, certainly in the updates to the code, are really focused on level 4 and above. However, we're also interested in level 3, and we accept that there may be some vehicles which end up being tested in such a way that they're being used at a lower level of automation than they've ultimately been designed to be used. So that could be, for instance, a vehicle which is essentially level 4 capable, or certainly in some specific operational design domains, but actually it may in some circumstances be tested more like a level 3 vehicle. But those are certainly the levels that we're interested in.
And it also covers heavy-duty commercial trucks as well.
Yeah, so it covers a wide range of vehicles. Now, heavy-duty trucks potentially have some additional requirements. So we have a freight licensing regime in the UK. So that they're very likely to also need to comply with those licensing requirements. Now that's based on the weight of the vehicle. But yeah, in principle, it covers those as well.
Do you have anyone testing commercial trucking in the UK?
Not to my knowledge. I'm just trying to think. No, not to my knowledge at the moment.
Yeah. So the code of practice, and I think you mentioned earlier, it sort of refers to the insurance requirements as being the same as the ordinary requirements for other cars, if I'm reading it correctly. And you mentioned you don't have an extra surety bond or other financial requirements. Has there been any concern from the public about that, or a feeling that the ordinary amounts might not be sufficient?
No, I don't think there has been concern from the public. I mean, we consulted quite widely on insurance for automated vehicles last year. So we actually started to take some primary legislation through Parliament in what was called our Vehicle Technology and Aviation Bill. Now we got that most of the way through Parliament, and a general election was called. And bills don't carry across between parliaments. However, that has been slightly resurrected since the new government was formed. We now have a new bill called the Automated and Electric Vehicles Bill, which contains pretty much the same insurance measures that we were working on previously. And because of that, actually, we've consulted quite widely on this. So we feel this is an area where we've got quite a robust proposal that we've had a lot of input from the industry.
Great. The with respect to the testing and the code of practice, there's been, some debate here in the States about whether you should be testing automated vehicles on public roads, whether in essence you're making the public into a guinea pig by subjecting them to testing. I know in your code of practice you sort of suggest that organizations should ensure the vehicles have successfully completed testing on closed roads or test tracks before they go out onto the public. And I imagine that, all responsible companies are certainly going to want to get a level of comfort before they're on the roads. But has there been any debate about that in the UK?
There's been some discussion. I think we've been quite lucky in the UK that we've had a lot of engagement at the kind of central or local government level with organisations who have wanted to conduct testing. And I think that's partly because they recognise that if they engage with us early, there's a lot that we can do for them. So, for instance, perhaps letting them know of any planned roadworks or changes to the road layout or any events that might be taking place or anything along those lines that might interfere with planned testing activities.
Right.
In terms of the public as a guinea pig and the points you made at the start, it is actually possible to test on the UK roads now as long as you can comply with UK road traffic law, and there are a lot of points in there around things like not driving without due care and attention and driver distraction, and there are lots of things in there that actually their kind of characteristics require an organisation to meet certain standards.
Right. And has there been any concern on the part of individual cities in the UK about wanting to have more of a say about how the testing may roll out in their jurisdictions? I know here we've had this ongoing debate about should the federal government be doing it at a national level, or should we have individual states or even cities be able to control when the testing happens or have different rules. Has there been a discussion like that in the UK? There's been a lot of conversation between organisations who have either tested or are interested in testing and the specific cities that they're interested in testing in. And in fact, we're really encouraging those conversations to happen at an early stage. Obviously, there are different kind of use models for automated vehicles, and I think one of the things that cities are very interested in, and also these organisations themselves, are what are the kind of what are the sustainable use models, if you like? What are the ones that are potentially going to, for instance, complement the mass transit networks, complement the existing public transportation? And so we're really encouraging organisations to engage very early with the cities to have those conversations and to make sure that the tests are actually designed in kind of the best the way that benefits both organisations. Right. Let's talk a little bit about public transit. How are you guys thinking about the impact that automated vehicles will have on use of public transit, especially with rideshare? I think there's a concern here that autonomous rideshare will be as convenient as your own personal car, but at the same price as a public transit bus. So people will choose to ride individually and create additional traffic or additional vehicle miles traveled and congestion. How are you starting to think about those issues as you think about the business models?
Yeah, I think those concerns are shared over here, and it's one of the reasons that we are encouraging organisations to engage with cities and local authorities as early as possible. I think we maybe haven't seen the same level of shareability as you have in some parts of the US. So, for instance, I know in San Francisco, Uber Pool, I think, forms over 50% of Uber's journeys. So we've perhaps not yet seen that kind of level of uptake in terms of sharing. But I think we very much are thinking about how can we essentially integrate models of AVs into cities in a way that kind of adds to the existing public transportation network. So it complements it, it drives more people to use public transportation rather than competing against it. So it's definitely something we're looking at.
More of a first mile, last mile approach to encourage, at least in the busy corridors, to keep transit going.
Yep.
When you look at the UK more broadly, how do you feel about potential use of automated vehicles in more rural or less densely populated areas? I know people look at the US and say, well, this is really more likely going to happen in a rideshare or fleet business model, and therefore more likely to roll out in an urban setting. And, it'll be 20 years before more rural areas. So given your population, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for rural areas. They tend not necessarily to be terribly well connected at the moment, and they suffer from public transportation services which don't tend to meet people's individual needs as well as they do in larger cities where there are more options. So I think there's definitely the possibility to replace, for instance, things like rural bus services, which maybe run on a fixed route just once an hour, for instance, to offer perhaps a fleet of maybe slightly smaller vehicles, which can run in a more demand responsive way, and perhaps using more flexible routing as well. So I think in that sense, there are some significant opportunities for rural areas, also for things like community transport provision of things like school buses and healthcare-related travel and social care and those sorts of things.
Right.
So these are very high-cost services at the moment. They tend to be very loss-making. So actually, I think automated vehicles have a lot of potential to offer those same kinds of services, but in a way that suits the individuals more. So it's more bespoke. It's more of an individual service that meets their specific needs, but potentially also lower cost to operate.
Right. One of the concerns that city officials here have expressed is that the ability to make automated vehicles really work well with public transit, first mile, last mile, and looking at overall transit solutions is that the cities need access to certain data that is controlled by private companies. I know the data rules are even more complex in Europe. How do you envision that playing out in the UK? Do you feel like you would need to require private companies to make their data available in order to facilitate better shared transit? Or are you thinking that would be on a voluntary basis, or how do you make that work?
Yeah, so coming back to your question, are we thinking we will need to require it, or do we anticipate we'll get it on a voluntary basis? I mean, I think our position would always be we would prefer not to require something in the first instance if there are ways that we can encourage voluntary sharing. Now, data feels like one of those things where actually, in order to get what we need in a kind of standardized and interoperable format, there are potentially good arguments to have a requirement, and there are ways for us to do that. So, for instance, if you want to operate a passenger service in the UK, you need to have a passenger license, and there are different licensing regimes that exist. So there are possibilities that's a tool potentially in the future. to use to require provision of certain data that cities and towns might find useful.
Right. Now, turning to deployment, sort of ultimate deployment, which I don't think anyone's ready to do yet, but once we get beyond testing, is there any impediment to deploying a level 4 or 5 vehicle tomorrow in the UK? Are there sort of other rules and things that need to be changed, or is it, theoretically possible?
Well, there are some aspects of the law which an organisation who wanted to deploy would need to secure an exemption from those parts of the law. I probably can't talk about them in too much detail at the moment because we're still having internal discussions. But there are certainly possibilities to apply for an exemption now. That's probably not going to be a trivial process in terms of the information that we would require to satisfy ourselves that we would be prepared to make an exemption. Obviously, from the UK government point of view, safety is our absolute top priority. So we would anticipate that a very robust, very rigorous and detailed safety case would form the core of that application for any sort of exemption. And we would still retain the ability to put any to apply specific constraints and parameters to any exemption that we did grant.
And would the exemption be required if it was an ordinary vehicle in terms of having a steering wheel and would otherwise comply with the physical attributes of a normal vehicle? Setting aside the software, or is an exemption required regardless because somebody wouldn't be driving it?
Yeah, so it's the second of those. So an exemption would be required regardless. So our regulations govern both the construction of the vehicle, which would include things like the physical design aspects, so things like whether it has a steering wheel or not. But they also govern the use of the vehicle. So it would be required in either of those situations.
Okay, and you mentioned that in order to get that type of exemption, you would, want to see certain information. So, are you thinking of it like a type approval or what we would call pre-market approval for each manufacturer in order to be able to deploy automated vehicles, or are you ultimately thinking down the road that it would move toward a different model? In the U.S., we have self-certification where companies certify that the vehicle meets certain standards, and there's no actual testing or pre-market approval that's required. And there's a debate about how that regime may or may not change for autonomous vehicles, but which regime does the UK have now, and are you thinking of going in a different direction?
Yeah, we don't have a definite position on this yet, so we've been following some of the conversations that our counterparts have been having along these same lines with interest. So you talked about some of the conversations in the US. There have also been some proposals put forward by the Australians as well. They're all very similar, so I think maybe they've used slightly different names, but essentially they're describing the same sorts of things. I think what we hope is that when we go through the first few applications for exemption, that we will have be able to form a view about what the best longer term process might look like.
Right. And some of the concern here is that even if you wanted to do a pre-market approval or a third-party testing regime, it's very difficult to understand at this juncture what that testing would look like, in order to make it kind of apples to apples across different providers.
Yep.
Okay. And the UK has also been doing some investment. You put out a competition for some funding with matching private grants. Can you tell us what you all are doing there?
Yep. So a number of our objectives at CCAV is around ensuring that the UK the research on connected and autonomous vehicles in the UK is effective, and it's targeted at delivering value for the UK, and also that it's coordinated as well. So we have run a number of competitive grant funding competitions for organisations, for the industry to apply for funding for feasibility and research and development projects in this area. So we've run CAV 1, CAV 2, and we've just launched very imaginatively named CAV 3. And these are really about growing the UK research and development base. So for these grants, the research and development has to be conducted in the UK. So businesses have to have a UK subsidiary. And through that subsidiary, the actual R&D has to be performed. So it can't just be effectively, if you like, a clearinghouse for cash going abroad. The physical R&D has to be conducted in the UK. But we have seen quite a lot of innovation come from the previous couple of CAV calls. The current call is a very open call, so we're interested in looking not just at deployments of level 4 or 5 automation, but also things like the business models that might support AVs in the future. And we've also, for the first time, opened up this competition to off-road uses of CAVs. So potentially things like warehousing and agriculture and different applications as well.
Interesting. And what are some examples of projects that have been funded in the past? The projects that have been funded in the past are all still ongoing. So these tend to be kind of multi-year projects. And the idea is that generally they have different project phases where they get increasingly more ambitious. We have funded a project called Gateway, which is operating in the Greenwich area of London, and that is operating some pod-style vehicles in shared space. So it's operating around the O2 arena, and it's kind of sharing its space with pedestrians and other road users. And we're getting some good intelligence from that project about how AVs interact with other road users and pedestrians. Right. We have also funded a project called UK Auto Drive, which again is pod-style vehicles operating in Milton Keynes and Coventry in the UK. Again, they are hoping to increase the level of automation throughout the trials. That's ongoing at the moment. From our recent call, CAV 2, we funded a number of projects designed to look at mobility as a service style business models. So one called Streetwise, which will involve a company called 5AI and Transport for London, and a number of other organisations as well, to deliver effectively an autonomous kind of mobility as a service style solution within London. And also another project called Driven, which involves a young company, an SME called Oxbotica in the UK, and they will be operating between Oxford and London. Great. And when you see these the mobility as a service, are there attributes of that are different from what we might think about as traditional rideshare like Uber or Lyft in the US, or are they along that model?
So I think I think that there are some attributes which are different. So we certainly, our thinking about it in the UK is that it will be very much a blend of what we currently consider as sort of public transportation and what we would currently consider as private transportation. And so it would be very much a mixture of both of those. I think we have much less private car ownership in the UK generally than in the US. We maybe see, particularly in cities, potentially see this as a means of encouraging greater use of public transportation, and also potentially encouraging more active transportation. So by that, I'm talking about things like cycling and walking. So we've got a couple of, I suppose, high-level agendas around air quality and also around health. So encouraging people to do more of that active transportation is particularly useful on both of those fronts.
That's great. And just to finish up, what has the consumer sentiment been overall toward autonomous vehicles? I know in the Code of Practice, you were encouraging organizations to have a public relations and media communication strategy to educate the public about the benefits and kind of explain what's going on with the testing. There have been a number of studies here where people have concluded that, Americans don't want autonomous vehicles, or they certainly don't want to pay for autonomous features and things like that. And I think there's some debate here as to, whether anyone really knows what they want until they see it, and how much that really reflects consumer sentiment. So how are you guys thinking about that and thinking about kind of educating the public and making the case for autonomy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the public mood is still evolving here, and I think that's the case everywhere. I think that within the UK there has still been relatively few real world kind of trials and deployments. So I think for a lot of people this maybe still feels quite far away. I think what we do see is that when we have kind of ordinary members of the public experience an automated vehicle for the first time, generally they're often quite surprised by the experience. They're often maybe more positive than they thought they would be. So I think we recognise that one of the things that we could usefully do is actually try to connect more people with this technology to make it seem more real, and perhaps to remove some of the kind of the mystery or some of the hype or some of the sensationalism surrounding it. But I think this is something that is going to change over time. Obviously, it's going to be shaped by the kind of the position that the industry takes, and this is one of the reasons why we are very keen to ensure that these vehicles are safe and secure by design, because that's going to be extremely important. It's going to be one of the main factors to gain public acceptance is going to be demonstrating that these vehicles are safe to use.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great place to leave it. Thanks so much for talking with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again to Lucy for joining us. We'll put some links to the UK materials she referenced in our show notes. And you can find the show notes for this episode and all episodes on our publication at medium.com called Smarter Cars. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.